Good evening, gentlemen. I'm talking to you after 2 days as I was out on important work. I'm back, and now I'm going to discuss the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war has now taken a new direction, and that is, it is moving more dangerously closer to a world war. In fact, it's going to be a test for NATO. Now, one thing, let's get it very clear that the Ukrainian offensive failed. I think, as per my reports, the maximum territory which they could took was about 250 square kilometers, which is nothing. And I believe the Russians, another counteroffensive, took another 250 square kilometers. So it's 1 plus 1 is 0. Both were on the same level. But the Ukrainians have suffered very heavy casualties. And for each Russian killed, the Ukrainians have lost 9. Now, that is the crucial point which I must make out here. That means the war is not going well for the Ukrainians. And Zelensky, if you have noticed, after the last NATO conference, has lost his bravado. I mean, he was talking here and there, and now he's totally silent, chup ho gaya, not saying anything further. He has realized that he cannot win the war. Now, that is the first thing which I must make. The Russians have followed the policy of attrition and they have worn out Ukraine. With the result, the Ukraine will take half a century to recover, if at all it does. Because my way of looking at things is a little different, and as a military strategist, I can tell you that Vladimir Putin has drawn a red line as far as Ukraine is concerned, and even as some of the East European countries, including the Baltic states, are concerned. Because these are the states which have been most vociferous in their opposition to Russia. Frankly, I couldn't understand the opposition when Georgia, or for that matter, countries in the Baltic, Estonia, Latvia, they were part of the Soviet Union for decades. And Poland, half of it was also part of Russia. And then Poland was part of the Warsaw Pact. And whatever development which Poland came Poland's way, including East Germany, was during the communist regime. Anyway, communism is dead and gone like the dodo. I think it was a great disaster as far as Russia is concerned because communism destroyed the mighty Tsarist and Russian empire. So I think people who talk about communism must remember that communism is a nihilistic doctrine, a destructive doctrine, and that is where it has failed in the world. Gentlemen, now as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned, there have been further developments. There's a bridge linking the Crimea with Russia, which was attacked and damaged badly, and that is a lifeline bridge for Crimea. Now, the Ukrainians have kept silent about it, but the Russians have accused Ukraine of this terrorist act, and they have let loose a tremendous retribution. Now, one of the things which has happened in Ukraine is that Russia has cancelled the grain deal. Now, the grain deal was like a lifeline for Ukraine and also for the world because Ukraine is the biggest producer and exporter of wheat. But now I think 60,000 tons of wheat lying in Odisha has been burnt. The docks have been attacked by the Russians. The grain deal is off. And the Russians have said any ship transporting grain would be treated as an enemy and dealt with accordingly. Now, it's a very dangerous situation, gentlemen. Ukraine, in my opinion, is on its last legs. The Western powers, that is, in particular France and Germany, are not going to support Ukraine very long now. France, as it is in dire trouble against the Muslim minority which has risen up against the French system. The same thing goes on in Belgium, and in Germany, there's a recession. Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, of Indian origin, I think he's at his wit's end also. He's having conflicting loyalties. He's an Indian, and yet he's become the Prime Minister of England. The man sitting in one corner is Joe Biden, who is really fighting on or fueling the fire in Ukraine. One thing is very clear: if the Americans had not given their weaponry to Ukraine, the battle would have been over months back. But the Americans have given them sophisticated weapons, tanks, as well as real time intelligence, and Ukraine has been able to hold out. But that's about all. It's like catching a straw when you're drowning. Ukraine is now in the last throes of death. Now, what is going to happen next, gentlemen? Next is Vladimir Putin. If I were one of his generals, I would make a thrust into the border between Poland and the Baltic states. Idea would be to reach the Baltic Sea from that point. And that is a point which is going to worry the Americans because they will have to come to the defense of these East European countries and the Slavic nations on the border of the Baltic Sea, and then they'll have to see what is to be done. Because if they activate NATO, it means it's going to be a full scale war with Russia. Now, Biden and party have to decide, you want a full scale war with Russia or agree to the Russian terms. I don't think there's any ambiguity about it. And now, Russia is on a very firm wicket. The Americans, as I've told you earlier, had made this plan, which was a one point plan to finish off Russia, break it up in another 4 or 5 states, like the Soviet Union broke up into 18 states, and the remnant of the Soviet Union, the main Russian state, they wanted to break it into 4 or 5 states, so that it would never be a threat to America or Western Europe for the next 100 years. But, gentlemen, Harold Robbins wrote, dreams die first, and that's what happens. The American dream has collapsed. But what has happened is entire Western Europe, which had been funding the war with Russia, the Ukraine war, is in the throes of death. France, nobody's talking about it, but I think is in dire straits. The Italians are worried about the minority community in Italy. And the East European countries, some of them have banned the entry of Muslim refugees there. Sweden, you know where it is. And Finland has thought that they'll put the eggs with NATO and they'll be safe. I don't think so. Finland has signed its death warrant. I remember making a video on this a long time back. Now, the question which is crucial to this discussion is if the Russians take the corridor between Poland and the Baltic states, then what happens? Will the Americans activate? I think it is Article 4 of the NATO Pact, which says that an attack on one country would be an attack on NATO. And how many NATO countries are going to support this war against Russia? Because, gentlemen, bear in mind that the days of the Second World War, where cannons were firing and tanks were moving, which is a conventional war, are over. There are tactical nuclear weapons, and Putin has already positioned them in Belarus. So, in case the thrust comes from Belarus on Ukraine, which is likely, I think, now, and the Western powers intervene in Belarus, they're going to be in for a shock because Belarus has got the nuclear weapons, the tactical ones, and it's not going to be a cakewalk. NATO, as I've already told you, has not fought a war physically for the last 78 years. They got no battle experience, nowhere. And they are soft. They have an aging population. Their birth rate is hovering around 1 to 1.5. Younger men are not available. It's a society that is growing old. They expect this society to go and fight the Russians? I mean, I could die laughing on a bed of nails if this is what the American plan is. They have enticed the European countries and they don't know what to do, the European countries. They thought it would be a cakewalk, but the war's on for a year and a half now. Russians haven't yet given up. They haven't won a decisive victory, I will concede. Yes, they haven't won a decisive victory, but they have done enough to upset the apple cart of progress and development of the West European countries, and at the same time, fissures have developed because of the inherent contradiction between the races which came to France and Germany. There was a shortage of manpower, and France and Germany allowed migration of the minorities from Algeria, Morocco, and other places, some of them which were the French colonies, and these have not assimilated with their society. And they are the ones which are like white ants eating into the French and the German state. I remember reading an article some time back, which said that Europe will become a Muslim dominated continent by 2025. Now, I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but the fact is, a declining population, no labor available, influx of more and more people from the Middle East and the war torn nations, what do you expect? America should never have dragged Western Europe into the war in Ukraine. And this war is a needless war. If they had conceded the demands of Putin not to expand NATO eastwards, which was what was promised by Bill Clinton. But he was the same man who in 1998 authorized the expansion of NATO to Eastern Europe. And then the subsequent presidents thought they will ring Russia by NATO, frighten Russia, and the fissurous tendencies in Russia will come out, and the Russian state may become 4 or 5 different countries, and everything will be honky dory. We'll have a jolly good time. Well, gentlemen, jolly good time doesn't happen like that. It's not so simple. Because there's a man who's sitting at the helm of affairs in Russia, and he's Vladimir Putin. He will outlive, if he doesn't die naturally, all the French leaders, the American leaders, the British leaders, and the German leaders, because they are the democratically elected ones, and they will go away. But Putin will remain. There'll be continuity. And the Western powers will have to meet their moment of truth. It's like facing the devil. For centuries, the Western powers have colonized Europe, colonized Africa, India, South America, and they built up their economies and the riches of these states. The British took about $3 trillion from India. They exploited the Africans, and their economies thrived. Now that the empires have gone, all the Western nations don't know what to do. They still have dreams of grandeur. Well, dreams are dreams, they're not reality. And now coming to America, I thought America played their cards very, very badly. I expected Biden to be a statesman to see that the American hegemony could continue for 100 years more. But he's gone about in such a way that the hegemony is going to finish very soon. Once Europe is subdued, which is very, very likely, whatever the result of the Ukrainian war, a desperate Putin, if he's losing, can do anything. You remember the old saying, a drowning man catches a straw, anything to see. And if at any stage Putin is threatened, you can be pretty sure that he will use the nuclear option. I think the president of Belarus is already in the mood to use it. And even if one or two nuclear devices are exploded inside Ukraine, the nuclear dust will expand to France and East European countries and there will be destruction. I don't think the French population, the Germans, are realizing what they are doing. They haven't realized that their colonies in Africa and India, everything is all over. It's past history. It's all over by the shouting. And now the best course for Europe would have been to chart out a new alignment and face the reality and try and placate India and China instead of adopting a tactics that we are superior. They are not superior at all, the Europeans. No way. They are now the laggard in economy. Their economies are going down and there is unrest. And the biggest unrest is the minorities. Look at France. There was a time when we had almost 32 French cities under curfew. Now, that's something I've never heard of in France before. Macron, who was talking that Russia must not be allowed to win in Ukraine, I think he hasn't spoken a word now. The German chancellor, who was handing over the Leopard tanks to Ukraine, he's now like a mouse. He's keeping quiet. The Poles are frightened. They were the ones who were the most vociferous in opposing Russia. Why they did it? Because they felt they have been wronged historically. But remember, gentlemen, historical wrongs have been done to every society, but that doesn't mean that society starts taking revenge. And Poland is a fifth-rate power. I do not know how the Poles really think they can survive by trying to catch the Russian bear by the claws. Can you do it? You try it with a grizzly, you will get to know what happens. Well, gentlemen, the war in Ukraine is now at an interesting stage. The grain deal is off, number one. The Russians are going to do something drastic. Number two, Europe is in the throes of death. There's internal dissension. Economy is going down. The empires are no longer there to support them. America is propping up the war, but there's a man called Joe Biden, and I don't think he's totally in charge of his mental faculties. There's a possibility that he's becoming senile, and we don't know what's going to happen. And America, if it loses, and it has to lose in Ukraine, then what happens? This cumulative defeat is going to tell on American psyche and would well mark the end of American hegemony. God forbid if there's a nuclear exchange, that would be the end of Europe and America also to an extent. And we will have to see that if Putin does make a move against the Baltic states, then what happens? Will NATO rise up and all of them come and attack and fight against Russia? Mark my words, gentlemen, it's not going to happen. And probably NATO will allow these small European countries to be just left as it is. Live and let die. That's what James Bond said. That's what probably the Americans believe in. So, gentlemen, I will close now and say bye bye to you all. Do subscribe to my channel, share it with your friends. In the meanwhile, I'll say Jai Hind, glory to India. Goodbye and take care.